Well, yeah, I think there's definitely risks, and I'll tell you what. When I was writing that particular section of the book, I was taking my greatest risks, and I thought to myself, hmm, I still felt myself being cautious and saying, "Do you really want to go on record and say this?" And I thought, well, you know what, I'm getting up there. But I actually had one of those existential moments where I thought, if I were on my deathbed, would I regret not just saying what I believed?
Did you know that 8 million Americans experience what is called a NDE, which is also known as a near-death experience? And in Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, he puts together a model of NDEs, which is a composite of common elements associated with an NDE, which there are a lot of stories in his book that are very comparable. And so I'll read you his model, which is very intense. A man is dying. As he reaches the point of great physical distress, he hears himself pronounced dead by his doctor. He begins to hear an uncomfortable noise, a loud ringing or buzzing, and at the same time feels himself moving very rapidly through a long, dark tunnel. After this, he suddenly finds himself outside of his own physical body, but still in the immediate physical environment, and he sees his own body from a distance as though he is a spectator. He watches the resuscitation attempt from this unusual vantage point and is in a state of emotional upheaval. After a while, he collects himself and becomes more accustomed to this odd condition. He notices that he still has a body, but one of very different nature and with very different powers from the physical body he has left behind. Soon other things start to happen. Others come to meet and to help him. He glimpses the spirits of relatives and friends who have already died, and a loving, warm spirit of a kind he has never encountered before. A being of light appears before him. This being asks him a question, non-verbally, to make him evaluate his life and helps him along by showing him a panoramic, instantaneous playback of the major events of his life. At some point, he finds himself approaching some sort of barrier or border, apparently representing the limit between earthly life and the next life. Yet he finds that he must go back to earth, that the time for his death has not yet come. At this point, he resists, for by now he is taken up with his experiences in the afterlife and does not want to return. He is overwhelmed by intense feelings of joy, love, and peace. Despite his attitude, though, he somehow reunites with his physical body and lives. Later, he tries to tell others, but he has no trouble doing so. In the first place, he can find no human words adequate to describe these unearthly episodes. He also finds that others scoff, so he stops telling other people. Still, the experience affects his life profoundly, especially his views about death and its relationship to life. That is some craziness, and I love it. Now, Raymond Moody Jr., the author of that book, works with today's guest, Frank Pasciuti, and Frank's book is called Chrysalis, which is about his personal clinical experiences with mysterious events that can strengthen your personal transformation or existential growth. I'm excited about this conversation. Let's get after it. This is Your Superior Self, episode 97, A Chrysalis Crisis with Dr. Frank Pasciuti. What is up, Superior Nation? Welcome back to Your Superior Self. Kara says hi. Welcome back. Happy New Year's. I have an amazing guest today, Dr. Frank Pasciuti from the University of Virginia. And Dr. Pasciuti primarily provides individual psychotherapy to adults 18 years or older. He treats a variety of problems such as anxiety disorders, depression, stress management, interpersonal conflicts, psychosomatic illnesses, and the numerous types of adjustment disorders that warrant professional care. Dr. Pasciuti also specializes in the unique problems associated with spiritual emergencies. These are typically precipitated by paranormal human experiences like NDEs or other psychic phenomena. I am obsessed with this type of research, primarily because it's crazy. I don't know. It's like everyone's experiences are different to the individual, but there are so many similarities and commonalities that just blow my mind. And I want to read for you right now a section in his book about a patient of his that wrote him a letter after they had an intense session. It was hot. I was wandering around the house completely in this moment of exquisite but not quite formed clarity, sort of a happy speechless stupor, taking delight in things like the texture of the dishcloth. Each and every little detail became so telling about humanity. We people are so fascinating, so driven to improve upon what we have created. I didn't feel any need to speak or express my experience, just to observe with the knowledge that there have been many here and nows before, and that I was a bit weary of all this now, slightly impatient but accepting nonetheless. I wandered out to the garage where that man who was my husband this time, that's how I thought of him, was talking about how he had so much to do and he was overwhelmed. I found myself feeling compassionately toward him. I was sad he didn't know what I knew, that when we lack connection with our essence, we remain tethered to small and simple world views. We are pursued by our own obsessions about the hows and whens and whys of our daily lives and our own importance. His love of rationality and evidence, as he incorrectly perceived them, were in terrible error. I also knew that I was supposed to leave him alone with his misconceptions, or he wouldn't learn. He wouldn't understand what I meant if I explained things to him. I just needed to let him and all others be, so I did. I didn't linger on that feeling. It was just something I knew and accepted, then moved on. I was able to shed emotional reactions like clothing, but felt them all the same. Then I became aware that I was aware. I became aware that we all just run around trying so hard, giving our best shot to the simple task of living. And the whole point of living is to get beyond that narrow personal viewpoint that this is all there is. We just keep trying. All this is busy work, mastery of simple skills that really don't define us realistically at all. It just keeps us busy until we wake up. This made me feel like laughing. Oh my God, how absolutely hilarious that I haven't seen the forest for the trees until now. How could I have missed this? How could I have ever thought it was any other way? It was so painfully obvious. Ha! The joke was on me. I remember now. I had a sudden awareness of the convoluted internal struggle of all humanity on Earth, especially Asia. I was a farmer in a rice field with my ox and with my feet waterlogged and my clothing filthy. At that exact moment, I was standing in my garage watching the paint job on the car glint in the sun. I had an internal vision of what I can only describe as my awareness, which I learned exists as a part of our meager physical form, spilling over and covering the planet Earth like a liquid on its way to touching all life in the place. All life is pieces of a great sun. Like rays of light, we bend and reflect. We relentlessly pursue. We cause shadows to be. We are the sunshine and are the sunshine at once, buffeted by our own reactions to whatever external stimuli happens upon us or we happen upon. I knew that linear time is really a human construct. There is no time, as we have come to know it. There just is. All there is awareness. We are gentle and unique fingerlings of awareness. We are connected to this awareness that is so much more than we can even begin to realize, and far more than the unaware mind can accept. The mysteries must be infinite. I knew this all, in short, because I had known this before. Really, I had always known this. I had just forgotten it in a while in this form. As I existed in this awareness and my husband worked on his car, I experienced a profound sense of relief. I had never experienced this kind of blissful relief and surrender. I was surrendering away my personal paradigm of how life works. Poof. And it was gone. It was that easy. I was suddenly aware I had reached this point of revelation before. This absolute heavenly ease was a familiar feeling. I had somehow, somewhere, sometime agreed to all of my life experiences, good and bad, and as necessary for growth. My most powerful growth seemed to come from pain. I knew that this awareness that I really was separate from this body. I was inhabiting and I was external. What people conceived of as death was merely the end of a short chapter. At this precise moment, I remember thinking something like, oh hell, that was a hard one, i.e. the learning curve of my current life up to this point. Damn, glad that's over with, along with a slight feeling of resentment at the process of overcoming this stagnancy again and again during lives. I, or it, wherever this viewpoint was coming from, was an old hand at this waking up thing. There was very little identification with the whole idea of Dawn, which is her name. Dawn was simply a vehicle that I felt compassionately toward, sort of like a really old car you love but didn't work all the time. Dawn was used to getting to this place to a certain threshold of alertness. She was only part of the equation. We had to work as a team. Now the threshold had been crossed once again. This was how it was supposed to be. This was the natural state of being. I understood that intellect is simply a tool, and priorities in our culture were unbalanced. That intellect is not really that important. Emotions are all important. That's how everything gets done. And I realized that fear is our most horrific enemy, teacher, motivator. Fear lies sneakily underneath all defeats, whether they be defeats of a mission because you never tried, or if you tried and could not succeed, and accounted as a failure. There's very little failure without purpose, maybe none. With this knowledge came a beatific and all-encompassing feeling of peace and contentment. It was warm. My body limp with relaxation. Without saying much to my husband, I turned around and went inside to my bedroom. I felt as if every strain, every nagging memory, every physical discomfort simply went away. My body was light as air. I was so free. I saw through every misconception I had about the world in one fell blow. Free, unburdening. My funny little mind was like a background program. I wasn't really associated with that mind at all, just aware of the little me program running in somewhere else. Up to this point, the experience recounted here thus far maybe took 5 minutes linear time. I think I might have said "oh" in response to my husband a couple of times. Everything took place in my own internal awareness. No one else could have had any idea what I was experiencing. There was no obvious physical signs. This happened all inside the world of me. Your doorway to who you really are is internal. Don't forget that. It's important. My state of profound peace was a bit like being drunk, but at the same time feeling and knowing that my physical reactions and my mental clarity were enhanced, not hindered in any way. I moved to the bedroom to lie down and submerge myself in this awareness. I was at peace with the thought of death. Wondered how it would be at the end of this time. I regarded my children without possessiveness. I saw them as ancient friends, outcroppings of the same awareness. There was a deep compassion toward them as they learned this world. They were not ready, yet, to be awake. Too young in this time. Perhaps later in their lives they would have a chance. I think children are rarely awake, but there are some. I knew they had to learn all the bits and pieces first in order to put the puzzle together. We all do. They had to be taught to feel pain and survive and learn from it. They had to be taught to feel joy and engage with it completely. They had to be fed a steady diet of compassion, love, and goodwill to continue on their journey. I was supposed to make sure that happened while they were young. I needed to show them a world not hemmed in by religion, not limited by science, not constricted by denials of our own experiences, not strangled by fear. I needed to show them a world fueled by how powerful they can be, how they are master creators of their own life. And then I lay down. I looked around the room and was awestruck by the creativity of the human race. This dresser, what a great idea. The different weaving pattern on the blankets and sheets, a testament to our desire to create and to continue to improve our creations. The books, undeniable proof of the need to communicate through symbols and stories, to be heard somehow across time and space. I had lived with these signs for years. I have even made these things, but never had I been so appreciative of them than at this moment. Now I could see it. Now I was aware that I was surrounded by records of creative acts wherever I went. In nature, the mathematical perfection everywhere, all of it alive with creative energy. And then for some reason the phrase "I am that I am" came to me. I am the great I am, that great conscious, that great aware living force. How his message got lost, how Jesus must have struggled to make himself understood. There was no arrogance or superiority in his words. His answer was as honest as he could make it. I apologize for you having to listen to me read for that amount of time, but I think the message is very powerful. I think that the experience is very moving, and I've heard like 10 different stories, like in different conversations or different readings, and it's just crazy how the universe points you in a direction. And I'm starting to find a lot of similarities with near-death experiences and similar experiences like the one you just heard. So I'm excited about where we're headed. I'm excited about where I'm headed in my journey, and the learning that is taking place with me spiritually. I'm excited about it. Make sure you guys leave a rating and a review wherever you get your podcast from. Make sure to hit subscribe. That way you can get all the episodes. If you want to follow me on Instagram, you can do that at tdowns80, on Twitter at downstrey, on Facebook at Your Superior Self. Guys, check me out. Make sure to let me know your thoughts on philosophies about life and spirits and growth and all of that great stuff. Existential growth is very important. So without further ado, I know I'm in a rant, but I love this stuff, guys. I love it. I do. So here's my conversation with Dr. Frank Pasciuti. Frank, welcome to the show. I appreciate you joining us.
I'm happy to be here, Trey. Thanks for having me on.
So before we get into these conversations, I'm a big fan of your book, Chrysalis, Crisis. And before we get into it, why don't you go ahead and give everybody your qualifications, because we're going to be talking about some interesting things. I want people to understand what your background is.
Sure. Well, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and certified hypnotherapist. I've been doing psychotherapy for about 45 years. Got my Ph.D. at Michigan State University back in 1981. And I have been using, I work with a broad spectrum of people, those who bring in your more conventional kinds of problems. And also I have developed over the years a sort of a subcategory of working with folks who have what are called spiritual emergencies. And so most of the gist of what I'm doing now is trying to integrate arrive at a model for understanding how some of these exceptional experiences may be on a continuum of normal development to what we would call supernormal development.
That's where you get me. Like, that's where I get so interested, right? Like, I was reading your book just 5 minutes ago, and you're talking about past life experiences. Mm-hmm. And learning from our experiences here on Earth, and then taking it back to our consciousness or whatever is on the other side or other dimension. And I wanted to talk to you about that. Like, what do you believe? Like, what do you, like, put it in better terms than
Sure.
what I just did.
Well, I guess if you're going to, my philosophy is that we are here as spirits having a physical experience to learn lessons so that we can evolve. And this, I believe, in more of an Eastern way, requires more than one life. There's an accumulated growth and wisdom, but there needs to be many, many different kinds of experiences so that we can kind of continuing to evolve and grow. And so that's a basic belief that I harbor. And I see it in a sort of multi-life developmental model. So I whittle down the actual areas where we grow and learn mastery, and how as we develop what I identify as 10 key areas of human development, they all are interdependent and they all ultimately contribute to a progressive evolution of consciousness. And so when I get people here who have, had, like, for example, a near-death experience, and they're trying to understand how it could be, if they're not crazy, how could they have awareness outside their body, for example? So you have to broaden the notion of how you comprehend consciousness or awareness as not just fully residing or exclusively residing in a physical dimension. And so one of the key beliefs I guess I hold on to is that the brain does not produce consciousness, but it transmits it. And that, a lot of the neuroscience these days, we're finding areas in the brain that we identify as being highly correlated with various aspects of consciousness, but they're not necessarily causative.
Mm.
So, that's kind of, and as we look at these key areas that I identify, I think through their continued mastery over lifetimes, they all contribute to an evolving conscious awareness of, the breadth of our consciousness.
Mm. So talking about that, like consciousness is everywhere, right? Like, so I was just reading about the microtubules, I think it is, some study, I think it was in 2016, I think it was,
Okay.
where some scientists in Japan made a discovery, not discovery, but they researched into these experiments where they discovered that the microtubules in our brains and in our brains vibrated with the quantum vibration, right? Like the quantum, I don't know what it is. Like, I'm not a quantum physicist or anything like that, but like essentially with the quantum space or the quantum vibrations that's going all around us, like the microtubules, which are the surrounding our cells in our brains. I think it's like Google microtubules and you'll figure it out. But essentially, the tubules and the quantum space around us are actually working together in some state or fashion, and it kind of like blew my mind a little bit. Like, so what if consciousness is all around us, like, and we're kind of the only reason why we have it is because the microtubules in our brain?
Well, the first part of that I would absolutely agree with, and there's a philosophical term called panentheism, which has been around for a long time, which speaks to just exactly that, which is that consciousness is all around us and it's within us, and we're a part of it, and we manifest it in certain capacities within the human sort of spectrum, if you will, and that consciousness not only exists everywhere and is the foundation of all things, but it gives rise to the physical dimension. And that's a flip. That's kind of a sea change, if you will, in how we tend to think of primarily physicality first, and that gives rise to consciousness. And that requires a definition of consciousness as being different than conscious, because those words are so close that you wonder, it's not just a mental thing. Consciousness can be both the vibrating energy when you break down an actual physical object, like a stone. When you get it down into its microscopic levels, it's actually vibrating, right? And this is what the quantum physicists have helped us understand, is that everything in a sense is vibrating, and it's like it's not as solid as we believe. Now, there's a reality. If you run into a tree, you're going to feel like it's solid. But when you start getting down into that micro world, you start seeing, aspects of consciousness where that energy is perceived very differently.
Mm. Yeah, energy, right? Like, in your book, you quote, was it Einstein who said energy cannot be created nor destroyed?
Yes, and if you're energy, right? If everything about you and I, all of us are united in that way, I mean, where are we going? I mean, if we give up the body, who's to say awareness doesn't continue? Where it resides, how it maintains memory, if you will, and how that carries over in between lives. That's the challenge, of course. That when you're coming from a physicalist perspective and you think it's all just about physicality, it's hard to imagine. How could that be? How can you retrieve memories of a past lifetime? And there's a lot of research here at University of Virginia, which first drew my attention, of children who remember past lives, and they are corroborated, and there's no way in which this could be something that they could fraudulently put forth. And people do have the capacity, I think we all do, to remember past lives, especially when there's the need to regain information that would help us in the present to continue to grow.
But I think in the book you actually describe a past life experience for yourself.
Well, that's one. I have to say this: I am not I am trying to be humble to recognize that, what I experience. I mean, some of the questions about past life memories, are they are they are they just like in the Akashic field or the Akashic field you've heard about, all that has ever happened is already is recorded, and am I just tapping into a life that once was lived on Earth and not necessarily mine, and in a certain conducive state of consciousness, in a trance state, am I tapping into experiences, memories, which afford me insights and maybe expression of emotion, all of which contributes to my healing around a certain issue or growing in this life, but that life didn't belong to me, let's say. So sometimes the jury's still out on that, or when you actually need information, if it is out there to be retrieved, who better than to retrieve something that's significant in their own life or from the past than the person who's had the experience directly. So it's there's plenty of what most people would, I guess, refer to as anecdotal evidence of people remembering past lives, and some of it being verifiable. And yet there's also experiences people have that they may mistake as a past life experience, like what Carl Jung would call creative dream work, where you kind of go into a trance state and you create a story that helps you gain insight and experience feelings and move out of a sort of an impasse you're having in life, or fear or phobia, something like that.
But I mean, but yours is actually in here, right? Like the one where you felt like you had some experience with your hands burning or something like that.
Yeah, that was real. I mean, actually, I'd forgotten about that. That was something that I had happen. Physical and fearful experiences. I did not know what to attribute them to. I had them very powerfully come through when I was a child, and then on numerous occasions in the middle of the night, I'd wake up and they weren't just like night terrors. They seemed very real, and then they subsided. And I quite honestly had forgotten about them over the years. And I was at the time in my 40s, and I started, doing some work with various shamans and past life therapists and breathwork people who were using all kinds of alternative approaches. And on one particular day, which I found to be coincidental to the day I was going to make contact with the man here who's deceased, Ian Stevenson, who did a lot of research with children with past lives, I had such anxiety about looking into this whole field because I felt this sense of potential persecution, and all of a sudden, in the middle of a meditation, that experience came back to me, and it was frightening. It was like, oh my God, I completely forgot about it. And then some more components to the story. I remember just jumping up out of my chair and thinking, oh man, that scares the heck out of me. I'm getting out of here. And then I thought, what am I going to run away from? Whatever that was is inside me. So I did some deep breathing and sat down and just let the story unfold more and got more, details from it. But largely the theme is what's most important. And the theme for me was, being persecuted for speaking out and, addressing things that, maybe most people won't believe or will be threatening to whoever, so it was pushing my edges for sure.
Being vulnerable to that, right? Like,
absolutely. Yeah.
But that's crazy though. Like you're meditating and you get the sensation that you experienced as a child, and now you're remembering it, and now you get scared, and you're like, why am I running? And you have a great quote in here, something about the only way out is in and through.
Yep.
And you sit back down and you meditate, and now it's taking you back to a life memory, maybe yours, maybe not, but you're tied up and you're being burned. Like,
well, yeah, and again, people could say I'm fabricating that, but it was very real to me. I felt sensations. I started choking. There was nothing going on around me in the room at the time when I was meditating, and I started choking as if I were choking on a flame. And I felt this stinging sensation in my hands, and it was just, I had to breathe through it. And when you do, and I did train as a past life therapist, and when I worked with a fellow by the name of Roger Wolger, who was a Jungian analyst and also a scholar out of England, who wrote a book called Other Lives, Other Selves, he often said that, when you are doing past life therapy with folks, the most traumatic moment in that life may be their death trauma. And yet the intensity of that moment is so great and so indelibly marked on the soul, if you will, that may have been a time when other thoughts came passing through that got so, if you will, entrenched in that person's mind, that they carry out that kind of pattern in a future life, and that he kind of spoke more of karma as being that, more like a pattern that you hold on to, and the release comes from both an understanding of it, but also the release of the physical aspects of it as well as the emotional. So it's a multi-dimensional approach to trying to get people to, work through what might be considered past life traumas, if you will.
Yeah, but for a doctor who's at the University of Virginia to put it in his book, that's got to be, that's how real it was for you.
Well, yeah, I think there's definitely risks, and I'll tell you what. When I was writing that particular section of the book, I was taking my greatest risks, and I thought to myself, I still felt myself being cautious and saying, do you really want to go on record and say this? And I thought, well, you know what, I'm getting up there. But I actually had one of those existential moments where I thought, if I were on my deathbed, would I regret not just saying what I believed? It's not like I'm standing alone in this or trying to create my own religion. It was more about, I've had enough experiences, worked with enough people. I've had people come and work with me from different places. And I've had women in, trance, a couple of different people, but one particular woman came in from Ohio with her husband, and I had him in the room when I was doing work with her, and she went back to past life, started speaking a language that neither one of us understood, and it was scaring the heck out of her. And, however, I think when you can get people to feel supported and held, then they go revisit these experiences, they diffuse them, if you will. It's the avoiding. That's where it's not my saying, but one that I learned from another organization, the idea of, it's counterintuitive to think of moving into something that frightens the heck out of you. But I liken it sometimes metaphorically. If you've ever done any whitewater rafting and you get caught up in a hydraulic, they often say, let it take you under, it'll spit you out down the river. The more you fight it and swim against it or swim away from it, the more it holds you in place. So it feels like that kind of, as you used the word before, vulnerability, a willing to surrender and let it go. But it seems like it's going to end up, it seems like the last thing you want to do in the moment.
There's also a story in the book about a child who was having dreams. He was like in the Air Force or something like that.
Oh, yeah. That's my colleague who's now the director of the program, Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, Jim Tucker. And the young boy's name was Leininger. They have, by the way, about 3,500 accounts of kids throughout the world who have these memories. And the reason you say, well, is it just childhood fantasy? There seems to be a state of consciousness that's kind of more common and prevalent when you're young, when you're around that 2, 3, and 4-year-old state. I've heard people talk about it in terms of, alpha, theta states. You get into like alpha and delta when you're sleeping, and there seems like there's a certain state of consciousness that you can move into or easily move into at that age. We try to do that with hypnosis now, or when you go into altered states, like in meditation, things like that. It's almost like changing the station a little bit. And so this young boy, it's a fascinating story, and it's so filled with details that could never have been known. These people some of these kids who have these experiences, their parents don't believe in stuff like reincarnation, so that kind of flips them out too. They don't know what to do with it, and yet they're seeing their child, waking up and crying and having all this turbulence and coming up with information that there's no way they could have ever accessed it. And so when you read that case, that's one of an American kid, which is interesting because many of the cases that the fellow who preceded Jim Tucker, the fellow who wrote this book, Dr. Tucker, was Dr. Stevenson, and a lot of his cases came from countries where there was an openness to reincarnation. So people said, well, maybe they're just making them up, and they conditioned their kids to think that these are the things that were happening to them. But what's fascinating, like in this child's experience, is when it comes from a family where they don't believe in it, they just didn't understand what was happening. They were just concerned about the welfare of their child. But their father, the child's father, was very tenacious and kept pursuing information and found more and more and more out that it just leaves you like, what other explanation can you offer? How did this kid access this information? How did he know all these details?
That's crazy. That was pretty interesting for me. What got you into this type of practice? Like, I think you started out business.
Yeah, that was because I grew up poor. So people said, hey, maybe you need to go in business and finally earn a living. Well, it's the fascination for me was always there, I think, because I had a family where my mother and a couple of uncles and my grandfather, they were all open to like mystical understandings, and nobody was particularly entrenched in any one particular religious path. So they were more open. There was an organization called the Rosicrucians, which is a mystical, non-sectarian organization, where it offers information that is some of the world's religions embrace, and some of them don't. But it's more like I got exposed to this kind of thinking, where people have experiences, like people have precognitions, where they have maybe a dream, or somehow in some way they have a premonition about something that hasn't happened yet. One of my uncles had, and I wrote about that in the book. And I see people who have these things. And, the first thing they ask me is, am I crazy? That's the first thing they want to know. Am I losing my mind? I had a dream that, such and such was going to happen, and exactly how it happened, it worked out. And how could I know that before it happened in time and space? Mm-hmm. And I'll say, well, when you get in some of these states of consciousness, time and space doesn't work the way you think of it working. It doesn't work in this sort of a linear, one thing after the other way, that you can, it gets, especially with the quantum physicists these days are helping us understand that, non-locality, mm-hmm. and the way time works, it's not all the way we may think it is.
Yeah, I've been researching that. It's been blowing my mind, and man, it's crazy. Like so in quantum space or quantum mechanics or whatever you want to call it, like time can go frontwards or backwards, right? Like it's crazy.
And so interestingly, if you just meditate, for example, or if you're in a deep sort of study, and how you have this experience of time going by, when you get into a deep meditative state, like I use a little clock when I meditate in the mornings, and if I don't, sometimes, I think I just go into this state, and all of a sudden my clock's dinging after 45 minutes, and it felt like 5 minutes went by. Or, if you're deep in a conversation with somebody and you're really engrossed in it, all of a sudden you look up and say, where did that hour go? Well, there's an example of how your typical awareness of the elapsement of time changes. And so, it's not all exactly sometimes the way we've been led to believe it is. Nobody's trying to conceal the truth from us, but it's just more complex.
Yeah. How do you meditate? Like, what's your technique?
Well, I have to say it's more of a hybrid practice. I first learned a practice with that organization I mentioned, the Rosicrucians. And then I studied and practiced with a number of Buddhist practitioners. My objective when I meditate in the morning, quite honestly, is not contemplation, and I draw these distinctions in the book. It's not prayer, but I include it in a ritual I do before. Prayer can certainly be a way in which you can raise your consciousness. But when I meditate, mostly I'm trying to not think and be open to awareness, and not focus on any thoughts, and to try to just truly just clear my mind and just be still, which is challenging and takes practice. And yet, when you are able to eliminate all the chatter, all the other stuff that crosses your awareness, and not get attached to anything, there's times where you'll hold that space for a while, where you're just in a pure state of awareness. And that is a very conducive state to having some of these anomalous experiences, where you may have a unity experience or a mystical experience, or you may have a deep insight, or information just seems to come in from somewhere because you're in such a conducive state of mind. But I don't go into meditation with that intention. I just go into it more as a sense of just being still and just being in pure awareness as much as possible, which is not so easy. Believe me, when I have a lot of stuff pressing in my life, it's difficult to get into that space. But that's what I aspire for.
Have you ever used mind-altering drugs to meditate or anything like that?
I'm a child of the 60s, so I have to confess to some of my explorations. I have not. I was once working with a shaman in Peru for a while, and had a chance to use ayahuasca. But I'll be honest with you, I wasn't crazy about the idea of throwing up through the night. But there's a way in which these days some of that is coming back. Back in the days of in the 60s, when they were using LSD and psilocybin to try to help people expand awareness, and then it got to become people using it as a recreational drug, and then it became illegal. But these days, there's more going on with that. Actually, Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore has got some research going on where they'll work with people in a more conventional therapeutic way, and then they feel when people are in a position where they may be safe, they have good ego strength, and there are maybe one or two therapists in the room with them, they give them a little psilocybin, and it seems to deepen the awareness. Sometimes people have insights and are able to experience emotions that maybe they're blocked around, and so there is a way in which there's a place for it. But I wouldn't just go, I would be cautious about using it. I've had clients approach me and say, hey, would you mind if I did some, DMT or something while we're working together? I said, I'm not really licensed to do that. So I wouldn't be comfortable using it in the room. But I can, but I think of it all as like ways of achieving altered states. And I think I can use hypnosis or meditation as ways of getting into those altered states if you're ripe for needing to access information about yourself or feelings or things.
So did you say you did do ayahuasca or you did not?
I did not do that.
Oh, okay.
When I was younger, I did use some LSD and mescaline and psilocybin a couple of times, but it was more out of the, what's this all about? Yeah, just curiosity. Didn't kill the cat, fortunately.
Yeah, a lot of people I hear they're going down to Peru and Colombia and they're doing the ceremonies and the rituals and meditation with different types of plants.
Yeah.
Which could be, like you said, mind-altering, different levels of consciousness, experiences, which is cool, but it scares me. Like, it just freaks me out a little bit.
I think, and I think you should, listen to that. Sometimes, I think of these drugs as opening and expanding awareness, but if you've got something that's percolating to the surface of awareness that you haven't really addressed consciously, and it's not resolved, let's say you got a buried trauma in your past that you may have repressed for good reason, because you weren't ready to integrate it, and maybe even now it's still loaded with feeling and confused thinking, and suddenly you just open it up with a drug. It could feel like what we used to call a bad trip. And I get people who come to see me sometimes who, as a result of, maybe just unwittingly, taking some really intense kind of drugs, will sometimes open up something that they're not ready to integrate. So they'll feel really out of control, and they'll even look sometimes like they're going through a temporary psychosis, maybe briefly. And these we can call spiritual emergencies. But what you want to do is, you're saying, if there's something deep within me that needs to be purged and brought out and brought into awareness, it's better to progress in measured steps. And yet there might be a couple of the final steps where, if you've done a fair amount of tenderizing and exploring, and it's really just kind of the last thing you need to do is just get the breakthrough, as opposed to the breakdown, then it could possibly be facilitated with that in the right hands with the right people.
Yeah, I would want to, if I were to do that ever in my life, I think I would want two questions answered. One, what is my mission here on Earth? And two, to experience God or that phenomena. You know what I mean?
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, those are two big questions. One's a big question. The other one's is a wonderful experience to aspire towards, for sure.
And I definitely heard people experiencing that. Like, if they go down and, I don't know if it's ayahuasca or they did the MDMA or what it was, but they said they definitely did like microdosing or something, and they experienced God in some form and fashion, and they're changed. Like, I can tell they're definitely changed. Like, their outlook has changed. They're just like, it's kind of like they've seen the other side. Like, they're kind of like they say they're watching a movie when they come back. They're just like, they're sitting back watching everything and basically have a higher emotional intelligence.
Well, I think people have these, what they call exceptional experiences. And I talk about one and actually give some details, because she gives an account of it in her book. A woman who had what would be called the unity experience, where you feel connected at a very high level. You suddenly have expanded awareness. You see yourself as as connected to everybody and all things. These are experiences, but remember, people have these kinds of experiences in other, like a near-death experience. People will have that. So again, it's like, what is the state of consciousness that one needs to be into? Can you enter that naturally? Do you need substances to do it? Sri Aurobindo, who's a Hindu high person from the past, who wrote and said, sometimes you can kind of access these states through the use of drugs, but in order to augment the ground, one needs to progressively learn to acquire the abilities to move into them more consciously and abide in those places. It takes work, but if you have a taste of it, then you know what you're looking for. So sometimes people will say, wow, do the, what's his name, Jack Kornfield, who I did some retreats with, and who wrote a book called After the Ecstasy, The Laundry. He'll talk about people have these experiences and then they got to go back into life. It's like, it's hard. Many people don't sustain them. They're changed by them. But, you have to say, okay, well, how do I know that these experiences are out there, are within me, if you will. And at the same time, I'm still here on earth, still need to do my job, raise my kids, have my relationships, whatever else I need to do.
Yeah.
So
it's kind of like this, right? Like I haven't experienced that type of happiness, right? Like that level of happiness that you talk about in some of these NDE books, near-death experiences, where they go, they experience this out-of-body experience, and they feel this happiness that is unmatched, that you cannot even measure it. And they, I guess they experience Jesus or God, and they're either faced with the question of come with us or go back to your body, or kind of like your work isn't finished there yet, and they re-enter their body, and it kind of like they don't experience that same type of happiness. And I feel like some of these mind-altering drugs or mind-altering states can do the same thing, where you experience that happiness of changing your consciousness, but it's influenced by something else.
Well, that's a good point. It's hard to sustain. You may get a taste of it by having used a drug or having had a significant experience which expanded your awareness, but then you recontract back to your baseline. So there's a sense of saying, okay, I got a chance to, or I had this opportunity to personally experience what it's like to have to be in touch with an expanded range of consciousness, which is our potential. For all of us, we all have that potential. But then we may recontract back into life, and so one always maybe longs for getting back to that place. But if the expanded awareness also brings in memories or unresolved conflicts, then you may get thrown back into that re-recognition of things that were not resolved in your life. And so not all near-death experiences are positive. Many of them are, but there's some negative experiences where people, and by the way, you're always going to bring in your own biases. So if you have this incredible sense of love and peace, or a sense of being around you, you're probably going to label it what you know. You can call it Jesus, Buddha, or whatever. But you don't, because we're reaching for understanding, and so we're going to pull from whatever already established conceptions in our mind to label.
So you're pretty comfortable with all this. Like, I mean, there's nothing that really surprises you anymore.
No. I mean, I've been exploring this stuff for a long time, but let me tell you, I have a long way to go. I don't, I just feel like there's so much to know, but I guess I've had enough personal experiences and worked enough with people, and they seem very, very legitimate. Nobody's out there trying to like sort of get into some sort of like spiritual superiority, headset or something. But I'm fascinated more by, when you get back down into the trees and, you pull back the view from the forest and you say, okay, so what do I need to work on in my day-to-day life so that I can maybe continue to grow and evolve, so that I can have some of these expanded states, and maybe I can abide in a place of love more, and compassion, and a sense of connection with everybody. Then it gets down into some of the key areas I identify in the book, which is learning to master the physical dimension of life, your intellectual, changing your beliefs, learning more, learning to be open to all your feelings and emotions, trying to keep a clear moral conscience, being more open socially. And then, these other 5 areas would be like, being open to modifying your sense of identity, how you see yourself, expanding in your range of intimacy and connection with others, asking those big questions like you were saying before, those, why am I here? Those are the existential questions of life. And then they all open you to more an expanded intuitive awareness of life and a spiritual experiences, not necessarily religious, but as those areas get more and more mastered, they usher in, I think, expanded capacities for having more intuitive psychic experiences and even spiritual experiences, and then they become confirming that yes, indeed, I do have these experiences, and they are transpersonal. They're beyond my usual personal experiences.
Mm. Yeah, existentialism is. I learned that from Viktor Frankl's book, which I love. It's like one of my favorite books. I carry it wherever I go just to remind me of his story and kind of put things in perspective for myself. But what fires you up? Like what are you researching right now, and what are you most excited about in the next 90 days?
Well, one would be right now I've been thrown back to trying to take care of my physical health.
Mm.
So in the most basic sense, but I would like to get back. I think for me, in terms of what's already been started with this book, what I'd like to do is I'd like to focus more on what I address in the last part of this book, which is how can you use these key areas that I just identified specifically to expand consciousness so that we can have intuitive and spiritual experiences, because there's nothing like having an experience. I know a lot of people who are fascinated by all this, including parapsychologists and people who are interested in all these anomalous experiences, but they've not had them. They're fascinated with how can they happen, But when you have one, then you're starting from a personal experience, and then you're trying to find out, how did that happen to me? What was that? You get into those words like ineffable. How do you put words to something that seems like it's indescribable? So for me, I'd like to learn more about just focusing very specifically on how, to what degree, like for instance, paradoxically, gaining mastery over the physical dimension may require that we are less occupied with it, less preoccupied with it. So if you have your health and you're living within your means and you have room, board, and shelter, and you're able to eat, a mini example of this might be when you're meditating, you're trying to have mind awake, body asleep, and that includes everything else about the physical world. It's trying to be outside of awareness. So part of the mastery is to say, in order to open to the spiritual, is to quiet the physical or calm the emotional, and not get caught up in a world of just kind of cerebrality, thinking. So some of these keys, to me, are fascinating in that the crises that I identify in the book mostly is to bring attention to each of the keys through a story, and to say that, if you learn to use your crisis, especially if it's awakening you to various keys, more than one at a time sometimes, then it may open the door for you to gain greater mastery in that area, and that contributes to the transformation.
Mm.
Did I answer that question? I certainly ran.
Yeah, well, what do you got going on in the next 90 days that you're fired up about?
Well, right now I'm fired up about getting back in and plunge. I'm looking at more of world writers who are talking about emergence. I went back and picked up Teilhard de Chardin's book on the phenomena of man, and I decided to to challenge myself to just do a great deal of reading in the area of evolution and emergence, and see if I can't get a better handle on how that evolution, what it needs, what in a real sort of identifiable, conventional way, what is required of us to do the kind of growing. I mean, if you take that existential notion you were talking about, like if we are here, if the purpose of our existence is to evolve and grow, and as Teilhard de Chardin would say, to reconnect with the divine, that's our potential. Then how do we really operationalize that? That would be my interest.
Mm.
I mean, how do we take that out of the philosophical, heady part and say, okay, so what do I do in my life on a daily basis that can help me achieve that goal, without having to kind of go into a cave somewhere in India and just, cut myself off from the world? How do I do that while I'm still engaged with the world?
Mm. Yeah, I think I'm doing that right now. I think, so I've been on this mission of trying to be successful, and along that way, I've become aware to the fact that the voice in my head is not who I am. It's the false self. And I read a book called Driven by Dr. Doug Brackman. I always say Brackman, it's Brookman. And he talks about how 10 to 15% of the world has this, these two types of alleles. They have the hunter mindset, and it has to do a lot with adult, ADHD in one of the alleles, and how the way that our brains work is that if you have these two type of alleles, like your dopamine doesn't fire, like the receptors, like it takes a lot of dopamine for me to feel rewarded. So like I keep moving from thing to thing to thing because I'm not getting that reward. Like I'm reward deficient on things,
Mm.
and so I have to quiet my mind a lot because my mind's always, you're not good enough, you're not doing this right, you're not doing that. He calls it the monkeys, and then he has the heart, which is the old brain. He calls the elephant. So the elephant feels a ping, the monkeys go off, and so there's a type of meditation that he uses. With It's kind of like visual meditation where he opens his eyes and has a fixation on something like a candle, and he does like a heavy breathing in the stomach, and it's able to not have any thoughts or quiet the monkeys that are in your head, that false self that is talking to you saying, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do this. And then realize that because the way that I'm wired, I would always, ask the question, let's say the 100-foot pole over there is, if I climb to the top, that's an achievement. And it's like you ask yourself, what do you do after you climb that 100-foot pole? And it's like, all right, well, I guess I go climb the other 100-foot pole that's next to it, or I do this, or I do that. Well, the real answer is that there is no 100-foot pole, that you've created that yourself, and that there's never going to be an end. You have to realize that you create these goals, and you feel like that's going to make you happy in the end when you achieve them. And
No,
it's not.
I just think it. Yeah. Well, I have a chapter in this book called Human Being or Human Doing, and learning how to just be. And as a matter of fact, you asked me about the meditation before. I often talk about the first challenge in meditation is quieting the monkey mind, where you want to think, you want to jump from tree to tree, from thought to thought. It's hard to settle down and just be still. There's a great book that was out. I don't think of it right now. It's by Richie Davidson. It's called Altered States or Altered Traits, and it's about meditation. And see, I think there's, I'm not, when I talk about all these experiences and anomalous experiences, I am not suggesting that I don't believe in all the wonderful things we're uncovering about how the brain works, because it is the mechanism in the physical dimension that enables us to have expanded awareness, and we utilize it as a transmitter. But one of the interesting things that these folks talk about is that sometimes you meditate, you go into this wonderful state of expanded awareness, and you feel blissful and love, and you come out, and then you re-enter your world. But what they're finding is that because of the brain's capacity and neuroplasticity to change and modify, that if you get into meditating and you do it over years of your life and for a long period of time, you actually don't just enter a state, but you establish new neural patterns that become more a part of who you are all the time. And it sustains itself. And so people might say, hey, man, you're always so hopping around doing this, doing that, always chasing this, chasing that. And all of a sudden you seem to be more at peace. You seem to be more centered, less easily going off. And so what's going on? And so what's happening is you can change those neural patterns. But being aware of that, and you have an excellent example of awareness, of saying, hey, I am aware that I've always been moving on to the next thing to conquer. What is that part of me that is restless, that wants to move on to the next thing? Why can't I just be still and be at peace? Those are wonderful things to contemplate, because if you can get into a place where you say, I am okay with just being, and actually when I am still and I am being, I start having awarenesses. I start having elevated states of love. I start just feeling more joy, and I start feeling more bliss. And it's when I start having those experiences, I don't feel as compelled to have to go out and climb the next mountain.
Yeah, because once you climb, in my opinion, you climb that mountain, and then, then it's like, what now? And we put that mountain there, like we create that mountain, like there is no mountain. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I feel so much better now, like the awareness of that, right? Like there's a morning routine that I have to do to feel my best. Like I have to go out and run. I have to come back and meditate. I have to then do some, not cold water immersion, but like I'll do my shower, and then I'll do the last 3 minutes cold water, and then that helps me get geared up for the day, and then I'll read something from a book, whether it's Chrysalis Crisis or something else, and then I'll journal. And I have to do those things to feel like quieting the monkeys, like getting me to be the best version of myself, to get those chemicals geared up in my mind to help combat the negative thoughts and the negative, because I mean our brains are automatically wired to be negative,
Yeah.
and it helps me be positive. And like you were saying, if you can be positive and force the positive thoughts, and you can rewire your brain to try not to be so negative.
Well, I think that's a wonderful ritual, Trey, because I feel that I got onto something like that myself back in my 40s, and I have to admit it was probably part of a midlife crisis when I was
Real quick.
looking for meaning. And I started that same thing. I get up every morning. I started getting up really early. I had 3 children. They were all staying up later. They were getting to be adolescents. And I thought, I'm just going to go to bed earlier and stop eating, whatever I do, waste time at the end of the day. Just get up early and start a process of just journaling and reading spiritual literature or stuff that's interesting to me, and then meditating, and then doing some exercise, and then getting out on my day. And I found that was a very calming, stabilizing touchstone every morning, and it really helped me. So, and I try to do that now too. I just feel like if you want to, uh, you know, enter those waters of your mind, you'll find yourself thinking that way. You'll start changing, your patterns, and I think you change your brain waves too, for that matter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It definitely, I mean, you can definitely feel that, like, the chemicals change in you, right? Like the dopamine, the serotonin levels. I mean, and like we were talking about earlier, how you were talking about having a conversation and changing your mindset, not changing your mindset, but feeling like you might spend an hour talking to somebody, and it feels like 10 minutes. Where I've also been studying this flow state of mind, this idea by, oh man, what is his name?
Oh, what? Yes,
Chikai.
Chris, I know what you're talking about. It's got a long Polish name, I think.
Yes.
Chickamani, something like that. Yeah.
Chikai sent
And
me. I can't remember what it is.
yeah, yeah.
But it's like this.
Martin Martin Seligman is also onto that. Positive psychology is now emerging and trying, addressing more of these flow states. But you're right. When you get into that flow state, it's a beautiful place to be.
Yeah, because the prefrontal cortex shuts down, and then that sense of self is kind of disappeared, right? And then, like they say, I've been reading a lot of Stephen Kotler's books, and he has, I don't know if you read him or not, The Rise of Superman and Stealing Fire. He talks, The Rise of Superman talks about flow states and extreme sports, and a lot of extreme sport athletes, like snowing and surfing, skiing and surfing, they experience flow state all the time, just because of the risk factor. There's like 17 triggers to flow, and one of them is being risk, and then that they can get to that state of mind just by the risk. He talks about like extreme sports and the records. Like over the years, it's exponentially grown to these massive records, and nobody could figure out why. It's because they get in these flow states, and it's almost like this superhuman level of consciousness that you can like achieve these records. And actually, the Navy SEALs are actually trying to utilize flow in groups, so that way they can work and function as one unit. Like whenever let's say you're doing a team building exercise, and you feel like that everybody's working on the same page, you can kind of read each other's thoughts. You know what they're going to do before they do it. That's flow, group flow, and the Navy SEALs they'll do a lot of research on that, and they're actually working with some retired Navy SEALs with some like therapy sessions, right? Like to take them out surfing and then doing talking therapy to help them with their PTSD, and it's actually working to get them in flow states and then take them back in and have a conversation. And it's, I mean, I feel like we're in this new revolution, right? Like, you've had the agricultural revolution, what is it? Industrial revolution. Now you're going to have like neuroscience revolution. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, you know what? It's interesting because as you're saying that, I'm thinking in the 5 foundational areas I identify in the book, the first 5, the social area, I would say that's a high. I talk about these keys these key areas that we need to develop. But I talk about using the keys in a higher octave for the sake of contributing to expanded awareness. And that is an excellent example of what you were just saying about using a social setting, a social situation where people learn how to work in a group at such a high level that they can start contributing to each other's expanded capacities. There's some parapsychological literature. I'm trying to think of this fellow's name, where he did a fair amount of experimentation with people who were in groups and showed that when they all were committed to trying to bring about an effect that you might consider parapsychological, like psychokinesis, moving an object with your mind, or telepathy, which you alluded to earlier, being able to pick up on other people's thinking, that when you're in a group of people who believe these things are possible, and you're supported, and you're witnessing other people being able to exhibit these capacities, you do yourself. It's almost like it just gets you caught up in it. And so the power of the group, when it can function at that level, you see it all the time in sport, right? How do people put things together? All of a sudden they rise above, and you think, wow, that's the synergy of that group. And if they weren't working together, could any one individual have brought that about by themselves?
Yeah, I just Googled his name. Is Mikai Csikszentmihalyi. It's like,
yeah, it's a mouthful, isn't it?
It is a mouthful, but
yeah, he's good. No, I've read his book. He's good. He's been
what's his
another
book?
person. Flow. The book is called Flow.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and another fellow by the name of Martin Seligman picked up on that concept and wrote a book called Authentic Self. And then after that, he wrote one called, which was very similar. It's a nice book. It was, gosh, I'm losing the name. It was after Authentic Self, but he plays on that theme of flow, and very fitting with your notion of the superior self. Like, what is it that we need to do to bring about these higher capacities?
Oh, absolutely, man. I wish I had the answers.
Well, we're all working on it, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's what it is. It's just the journey. Like everybody. All right. So I say this a lot lately, and I believe it to be true. It's like everybody wants to reward the success, but I feel like the journey is the reward, right? Like there is no finish line, really. I mean, it's like kind of like, everybody wants to feel satisfied, or like me, like I struggle with feeling that dopamine hit, that reward. Like I'm reward deficient. Like I know that, but I need to realize that it's the path, the struggles, the ups and downs. That's the reward, because it grows you. Like it, I'm totally different than where I was a year ago. It's kind of like that saying, right? Like a man doesn't step in a river the same place twice, or something like that. Like
exactly. Yeah.
I mean, the river's always flowing, and you're never going to step in the same water twice. And same for you. Like your body is different than it was a year ago. Like you're not even made up of the same cells. Like, I mean, your cells have totally changed since last year. I mean, it's insane. Right. And fun fact, I didn't know that your cells carry like memories, right? Like, so like genetically, like you're, I don't know if this is, I think I heard this on a podcast, but like your parents can pass down memories from them. And so like, I don't know, I kind of heard this on a podcast. I was like, kind of freaked me out a little bit. Like, what if like one of my ancestors or whatever had like, they fell off of something or whatever and had this terrible experience. And that's why I'm scared of heights. I have this weird like fear that maybe that's a genetic fear that was passed down to me. That's like crazy to me. Like these cells have memories.
Well, I think when you work with people who have had trauma, and they may be totally out of touch with, things that have happened to them, sometimes if you touch a part of their body, they remember. So the body remembers.
That's crazy.
And maybe your own body. And even when you do, like, for instance, I'll do past life therapy with folks. I don't do a lot of it, but occasionally I'll feel somebody's ripe for using the process. And they may be stuck in a story, and I have a sense of a twitching in a part of their body, or I have a sense that they're feeling a pain or something, and I'll just ask with appropriateness, can I touch that area? And all of a sudden, they'll just have this flash of memory that they were stuck on. They couldn't bring it, and all this feeling that accompanies it. And I'll think, where was that? And, when you work with people, sometimes I'll say to folks when they'll say, I'm not sure what I feel. I feel whatever. I'll say, where do you feel that in your body? And sometimes if they go to that body area, they'll sometimes awaken a memory. So it's interesting to see how it gets recorded.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, So like the hot stove example, right? Like you know that the stove is hot. Like when you go and you reach and you touch it, like before your brain can react to it, I think it's like your spinal column or whatever is like pulling your hand back. The body is actually responding to that hot stove before the brain is even registering that it's hot. Like it's crazy.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Go ahead.
go ahead. I was going to say, there's actually some parapsychological research that's really well done. You know what precognition is? Awareness of something before it happens. Well, they have a research by a man by the name of Dean Radin, who had people sitting before computers with these randomly selected 500 images. Some of them are very pastoral, mother holding a baby, breastfeeding, another beautiful scene with horses and cows in a pasture, and maybe another scene with somebody decapitated hanging out of a car after an accident. So you had, and all these scenes were all across the continuum, and then they were like randomly chosen by a computer, and a person would be sitting in front of a computer, and they would be hooked up with heart monitors and galvanic skin responses, and they'd have all these electrodes on their brains. And a full half a second before one of the images came on that was the most negatively evocative image, they already set off physiological responses to it before they even saw it. And nobody knew what was going to come up, but they already, so it was very fascinating.
Body knows.
Presentiment, and it's pretty solid stuff.
That is solid.
So how do they know? How did they know that beforehand?
I don't know. It's crazy, man. How can people reach out to you? How can they find more out about you, Frank?
Well, if they want to read the book, that's a pretty broad ideas about, everything from more conventional ideas about how I understand people to develop and grow to the areas that I would consider, more exceptional, like the intuitive and spiritual areas. I have a website by my name. It's frankpasciuti.com. The book, Chrysalis, Crisis, can be picked up, I guess, certainly on Amazon. And I am basically, here in Charlottesville, Virginia. And if anybody wants to go to my website, it's in the book. Feel free to drop me a line. I love responding to questions.
Most excellent. And to end it off, what do you want your legacy to be, like when it's all said and done?
Well, I think I would like to help make the supernormal seem more normal, more achievable. So the capacities that we have, the expanded awareness, consciousness that we're all a part of, to start seeing that less in a woo-woo sense, but in a real way of understanding that this is all part of our inherent capacities. It keeps us all connected, and it needs to be depathologized, especially if it's foreign to us. So we don't want the supernormal to be wrongly identified as abnormal.
I love it. Frank, thank you so much for joining the show. I love this stuff.
Well, it was great talking to you, Trey. I love your questions, and you seem to definitely have a lot of information from your reading, so it's mutually rewarding for me to talk with you.
I want to say thank you to Dr. Frank Pasciuti for coming on the show and hanging out and dropping a ton of great value on us. Thank you, Frank. I really do appreciate it. Guys, if you want to follow me on social media, you can do so on Instagram at TDowns80, on Twitter at DownsTrey, and on Facebook at Your Superior Self. Get over there, like the page, follow me, see what's going on. Guys, thank you so much for listening. I hope this episode has helped you in your quest of existential growth. Thank you, guys. I appreciate ya. Later.